Okay, well, I'm going to continue the theme, and first a few disclosures. I'm actually not yet on the editorial board, so I wasn't in the papers I discussed. I wasn't involved in the editorial process, so I can't be blamed for that. The other, you heard about Alan's great English skills and writing skills, and I'm sort of, when I take over, I'm just the opposite. I grew up in a town called New Bedford, Massachusetts, where English is a second language. So my skills will be a little different than Alan's. So I've been studying for this job, and so the first thing I did is I went to the standard tools of the trade for editors and writers, and two of the favorite books are on the right, the American Heritage Dictionary's book on sort of common words that get confused. So I've now learned when to use effect and when to use affect and all of those other things. And then of course the Strunk and White's Elements of Styles, which is really the classic book that teaches you how to write. And just I thought I'd spend a few minutes for those of you unfamiliar with this. I think many of you know E.B. White because he was the author of Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little, and actually in 1929 he collaborated with James Thurber on the very famous set of essays called Is Sex Necessary? Or Why Should It Matter? So when he was a student at Columbia, Professor Strunk would give these classic lectures in English classes, and E.B. White convinced his professor to publish this as a book, and it's become a standard, really, I think, for all writers. So E.B. White became really a famous writer for the New Yorker, and the most important thing to know about his position was that he negotiated a contract with the New Yorker so that he only had to come to work one morning a week. And I think that's a little different than the JASE job. I think it's a little bit more than just a Thursday morning job. So, and then the other thing to notice on here, the foreword is by Roger Angell. And Roger Angell, again, is one of the great baseball writers in America. And you'd say, what would be some baseball writer doing with this book? Well, actually, he's the stepson of E.B. White. So that's the whole area. So Friday night I had the opportunity to have dinner with Alan and to sort of pick his brain about some of the things I needed to do, and I mentioned about, I've been boning up on this, and he said, you don't need to do any of this. What you really need to do is, here's my go-to manual for how to be an editor-in-chief. And you can see that this is a book on how to use grammar and punctuation properly. It's the Grammatical Disasters and Punctuation Faux Pas, but notice that it's for grades 2 through 3 because most of our writers are not as skilled as classic English professors. So thank you for helping me go to the right resources. So to find a favorite paper, as Victor said, it's not an easy task. It's really tough to narrow down. A few guidelines, a few things I did is that first thing, I think most of the favorites end up being the guidelines papers, but I decided to really try to stick to original science. So I think we all have some really favorite guidelines papers, but those, as you saw, have been ignored this morning, but certainly should be high on your radar screen. So my interesting paper I want to discuss is from the May issue of JASE, so just last month, and it is a paper that looks at quantifying multiple jets of mitral regurgitation. It's an in vitro study and looks at some of the methods on how we use PISA. And I think this is really clinically relevant because as we now are doing mitral clips, as you can see on the color here, very commonly we're going to get multiple jets of MR. And the question is, can you just add those two together, or is there some complex formula that needs to be done? And so the authors of this paper really tackled this task. And to do this, so this is from Christian Seiler's group in Switzerland. They have a flow phantom model that they immerse in a water bath. And in this model, they can insert plates with holes in them that simulate a regurgitant orifice, and you can put in as many regurgitant orifices as you want, and you can put them as close together or as far apart, different sizes, and obviously since you machine this, you know all the details. And so here you can see that they used a single regurgitant orifice. Here's what the color Doppler is going to look like. Here's a double orifice about 1 centimeter apart. Here's a double orifice when it's 2 centimeters apart. What they did was they used both TTE and TE imaging to collect 3D data sets. and then the 3D data sets were cropped, and actually 2D information was taken from the data sets to make calculations of regurgitant orifice and regurgitant volumes. And some of the models that they used were the sort of the typical PISA, which they sort of said, okay, well, we've got 2 orifices, we'll just put 2 pieces next to each other, we'll see how that pans out. And they also, in visualizing these double orifices, they noticed that there was sort of a hemicylinder shape to this, so they also developed a hemicylinder and a partial hemicylinder mathematical model for the calculation of the PISA. And then they also did, since this was a 3D data set, they also did a 3D calculation using the true 3D data. So in summary, the data from the study, all the different methods were compared to flow meter, so that's the gold standard, so nicely we have a true gold standard. What they found was that when you had the double regurgitant orifices and they were too close together, the pieces would be fused, makes sense. If you did a single hemisphere PISA approach to these cases, you'd underestimate the regurgitant volume. If you used the double hemisphere to put 2 pieces next to each other, you actually ended up overestimating. And so for well, for the single orifice, obviously the hemisphere works. We've shown that for many, many years. But so for those 2 regurgitant orifices, if the pieces were not fused, if the regurgitant orifices were far enough away, then the hemicylinder method worked. And with that, they did a modification where they had sort of 2 bases to the hemicylinder. If you had a fused PISA, then you'd use that just single hemicylinder, and that was the best approach. But of course, the 3D method was better than any of the 2D methods, as you might expect. So this is a table of the data that I don't expect you to be able to read, other than it was a very nice display of all the data for each of the methods, whether it's 1 orifice, 2 orifices fused or not fused, flow meter, the 3D, the hemicylinder, etc., both for regurgitant volume and effective regurgitant orifice, for TTE and TE. However, one of the things that Alan and his team didn't see was there's actually a typo on this table, because this is the TE data down here, and rather than what's listed as TTE. So this is just another caution to authors: when you get your galley proofs, don't assume that we've done all the proofreading, that you are responsible for looking at your tables. And here graphically you can see, and I won't get into much of this, but you can sort of see when you use a partial hemicylinder, you really get nice data around that regression line. In color, each of these colors represents the fused orifice, the double orifices, or the non-fused, and the single orifices, and you can see that blue is the single regurgitant orifice, and so that even when you use the single hemisphere, the classic way we do PISA, it really works very well, but obviously it doesn't work as well when you have the double orifices like you'd have with a mitral clip. And then the last piece of data which I thought was interesting is that all of this was really great, but when you actually just looked at the moderate to severe or the severe MRs, and you looked at the different methods that you can see here, either looking at the error end of the curve or the sensitivity specificities, actually all of the methods, the good news is all of the methods actually work pretty well and are reasonable, probably good enough for clinical care. This is a neat paper that does some validation, shows you the right way to do it, but also provides a clinical context, and that helps us, I think, in everyday practice. So what did the reviewers and the editors do to make this a better paper? Well, I think it falls under the rubric of content and clarity. First thing, as was alluded to, is the review team made suggestions to clarify the title and make it so more descriptive of what was being done and not embellish the work, and also help clarify some of the methodology. Some of this work that was presented in the original paper was focused on the single orifice, which this same group had already published about. So the team actually asked that they really emphasize the novel parts of the paper, because that's what the readers really would want to know. And so that was all the stuff about double orifices. They challenged the authors to really justify why they used the various geometric assumptions that they did, and also why would TTE data collections be different from TE data collections. And so the discussion was enhanced with that advice. The original data was just the regurgitant volumes, and the editorial team suggested that the ROAs be included, which is obviously very helpful. So that was done. They helped streamline and focus the discussion, made it more readable. And I think a very important point is that there's no charge for color when you submit papers in JASE. And so those graphs that I showed you were all black and white, and it was very hard to see what's a triangle, what's a little box. And so by adding color, they made it a much easier set of graphs, not only to understand, but for me to display and for people to use in presentations. They also were encouraged to add some figures, like the flow model that I showed you, and of course put the references into the classic JASE style, which is a little different from some of the others. So that's really the paper I wanted to highlight. There's one other paper, since I do have a few minutes, that I thought I'd tell you about, and this was in the March issue. And this is a very different paper. This is a paper that looks at, are there two-dimensional measurements that we can use of the left atrium that give us a reasonable estimate of LA volume rather than relying on 3D? And the reason this is important is that for those of us who do core lab work, and we've got thousands of echoes in epidemiologic studies like the Framingham study or others, it's very time consuming to do a 3D or even a 2D measurement of LA volume. And some of these, all we have is an M mode. So what can you do with an M mode or just a few limited 2D measurements, 2D images of a left atrium to provide insight on LA volume when this data was collected 10 years ago and now the sponsor is asking you to assess LA volume. And so they posed the question, could you use some linear dimensions here? And they looked at a variety of different linear dimensions, compared it to the classic things we do for the left atrial volumes, like method of discs and area length. They came up with an elliptical formula, and the bottom line is that basically if you take the LA anterior posterior dimension and plug it into a formula that assumes an elliptical shape, you could actually get a reasonable number for your LA volume. It's a reasonable estimate of what you would get if you go through the true 2D method of discs or area length. And I think the key point, and one of the reasons I wanted to highlight this paper, was that this was a paper that used two populations. They derived their assessments with one population, and then they tested it and validated it on a second. And I think that's a really critical thing that one needs to do in some of these papers where you're developing a new formula or a new test. And many papers we see where the same population is being used to both derive and then validate, and that just doesn't cut it. So I won't bore you with all of the details of this paper, and again, the way the editorial team helped shape this paper was that they encouraged the authors to make the population larger so that it was a wider age range and body size, and some with disease and some without disease. And again, there was clarification to a variety of points. The figures were enhanced, and the discussion became a lot more focused. So in conclusion, I just want to tell you that I think there are many neat papers, many clinically relevant papers that appear in JASE. So I think that, as you saw this morning, there's really a favorite for everyone, and each of us went about it in a very different way. Our reviewers and editors do a phenomenally compulsive job, and I think their comments help elevate the quality of the manuscripts that appear in final print. As you can see, enhancing content, clarifying message, and as you already heard, assuring that these are hypothesis-driven and clearly stated hypotheses. As I take over, I really would value all of your help, because what we need, as you heard from Leonardo, are reviewers. And so any of you who are not currently reviewers in JASE, there you can see in yellow, you can email me and send us your name or contact information, and I would love to have more people in the pool of reviewers. And I just want to thank Alan again, as you've heard from everyone else, for his phenomenal job in maintaining and elevating the standards of this journal, and to the associate editors and the deputy editors who really have helped him do that. So I'm going to take two or three seconds more and just share with you some pictures. I just came back from the Galapagos, and where you get to see a phenomenal array of animals. And as I was viewing all this wildlife, I looked at different past presidents and saw, you know, you had the slow and steady, and you had the crabby one who pinches, you had the arrogant one with the big red breast to attract the opposite sex, and then you had the real voracious lizards. But Randy, this is the one I had a hard time with, the incontinent blue-footed booby, and I couldn't decide which of our past presidents was like that. So I thought maybe after a drink or two tonight we can figure out who fits onto that one. But anyways, again, Alan, I want to thank you, and I guess should I introduce our next speaker? Or are you going to do that? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
You're not the editor.
Jeff, I also want to thank you for putting on the session. For those who've attended, I hope there's been some value in this. I'm impressed, frankly, that the qualities that have been discussed that involve what makes a good paper also are important qualities in how to read a paper. And so whether you write papers or read them, and everybody reads them, it's probably important to note some of the elements that we've talked about today. I don't have any disclosures to make, and I do again want to acknowledge that ASC has a small family of journals, and I think the addition of CASE has been an important one. I'm going to talk about JASE because that's what I know something about, and because I've had essentially persuasion that there needed to be a scientific journal where investigator-initiated research could have a home, that we didn't publish just things that were invited, and we didn't publish just things that were by well-known authors, and that we gave people a chance to publish their work with the input that the editorial team has provided, which I think you've heard a little bit about. So let's run on here a little bit. In 1676, when Dr. Martin and I were young guys, Sir Isaac Newton said, "If I've seen further, it's only by standing on the shoulders of giants." And as you heard from Dr. Riglin this morning, you know, no success happens in isolation. And I certainly owe a great deal to Dr. Harvey Feigenbaum, the founding editor of the journal, and as I think most of you know, the founding president of the American Society of Echocardiography. It would probably not be an exaggeration to say that if it weren't for Harvey's passion for echocardiography, almost all of us in this room would not be doing today what we are doing now. But I'm going to shift a little bit to myself, and for those who don't know much about my background, I've got a short Alan Pearlman 101 here. My dad worked for the Eastman Kodak Company in what they pronounce there as Rochester, New York. And so I was exposed, no pun intended, to imaging at a very early age, and it sort of makes sense that I wound up in a career that involves imaging. As you've heard, I did go off to college intending to go to medical school, but I chose to major in English literature at Williams College. They had a pretty good English department, and I had always enjoyed reading and writing and thought that learning how to read carefully and write coherently would be skills that would be of some value to me in my career, and that they didn't teach that stuff in medical school. Turns out where I went, they didn't, and so I'm happy to have that background. It's certainly been helpful for a role as an editor. I landed in cardiology very serendipitously. I went off to the National Institutes of Health in 1972 because it seemed like a safer place than Vietnam, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to be when I grew up. I really didn't know whether I wanted to stay in medicine or surgery or pediatrics. I figured a job in the Cancer Institute would provide me a very broad basis. Of course, I was matched with the Heart Institute, and I wound up in Steve Epstein's cardiology branch, learned echo from Walt Henry, had a chance to write some papers on atrial septal defect, and thought it was sort of a fun way to do physiologic studies in patients without hurting them, and here I am, you know, a long time later. I think most of us wind up doing what we're doing because the stars aligned, not because we planned it that way. Unlike a lot of people, I've only had 2 faculty jobs in my life, which shows you that I'm not very imaginative. I went to the University of Pennsylvania in 1976 because of an opportunity to work with Joe Perloff, may he rest in peace, who was a brilliant teacher and had a very strong interest in congenital heart disease, and I thought it would be fun to work with him and use ultrasound. At the time, there wasn't much being done there on children. Joe, of course, moved to Los Angeles in 1977, and the job perspective for me changed a little bit, and so I began to look around, and a job at the University of Washington, actually joint job in bioengineering and medicine. I have never taken an engineering class in my life, by the way, but that job became available, and it looked like an attractive option. It's interesting that 3 people who were interviewed for and offered that job before me are all ASE past presidents who wound up having very distinguished careers. So it's been a good place to live. On the other hand, after 27 years of hassling with administrators about not having enough space or equipment or people to run a quality service and do innovative things, I decided it was about time to reinvent myself, and the opportunity came along when the ASE put out what I guess I'll call an RFE, a request for editors, because Dr. Feigenbaum had decided that after 20 years of editing the journal, it was time for him to step down. And several of my friends, and Dr. Randy was an important one, encouraged me to throw my hat in the ring, and so I did that. I thought it might be fun to do something different, and that because of my background, that might work out. I read a book on editing that told me that editors need good judgment tempered with imagination and intuition and a wide and sound knowledge of their discipline, that they should be endowed with a firm command of language and a well-controlled passion for accuracy, and that they must exercise tact in dealing with authors and common sense in revising the language or structure of papers. And I thought those things made sense, and I could probably do that. I've learned in the past 10+ years that there's some things that those interested in serving as an editor, whether for JASE or another journal, should remember. One is that being an editor is a tremendous opportunity to learn. It's sort of neat at my advanced age to learn something new every day, literally. It's also a tremendous responsibility. It comes with deadlines, it comes with some stresses, and it does lead to aging. Nobody gets younger as an editor. So here I am on the far left, just having moved to Washington from the East Coast, and I figured now that I'm a Western cowboy, I needed to grow a bushy mustache and let my hair grow long. I cleaned up a little bit as my career went on, and the photo in the white coat is one that was taken around the time that I became the journal editor. The one on the far right is what I think I look like when I look at myself in the mirror most mornings. But I'm not the only one that's changed over time. That's not John Denver in the middle of this photo. That's our beloved Dr. Randy in 1984 at an ASE board meeting, flanked by David Son and Richard Popp, all 3 past presidents. And it just goes to show you that being a past president doesn't mean that we won't make fun of you. So things change over time, and as I've reflected on it, you know, back in the early days, Randy and I were both into long hair, and we've kind of moved on to longing for hair. When I was young, I spent weekends looking for a new hip joint to hang out, and now I worry about getting a new hip joint. I enjoyed cars, and so in my younger life, I was always hoping to get a BMW, and now I sometimes I'll worry about that. But there are some things that don't change very much, and these 2 pictures are of the journal cover from the first issue of the journal, 1988. It's my own personal copy with the little tear in the cover. This was November 2005. The appearance is pretty similar. ASE and Mosby, at the time our publisher, developed logos, and we did put in a little tagline here for this thing called www.asecho.org, because apparently in 1988 Al Gore had not invented the internet yet. But the appearance looked a little different, and we thought it was time to make some cosmetic changes in the journal and the cover and the inside. And one of the earlier covers, we changed the blue color. We used blue and red because ASE has used those colors for a long time. We put some pictures on the cover. About 2015, we developed the current cover, which comes from the ASE logo and the brand in terms of shapes and colors and hues. These things are actually all in the logo. I can't take credit for inventing this, and I can't tell you that it's going to remain that way forever, but it has changed the appearance of the outside of the journal. The inside's changed as well. On the far left is the original format of the table of contents, which was simply a listing of journal titles in sequence without any particular order, and I thought we needed some navigational aids, and so we added table contents where we had section titles or subsection titles. We used colors to highlight things. We included editorial comments where appropriate, and thought it would make it a little bit easier for readers to pick articles that they were interested in. And this one I'm proud of, and Mike just mentioned it, I think, and that is that in the original days of the journal, we charged authors for color images, and so many of them would show their tissue Doppler images in black and white simply to avoid paying color costs. My publisher, Jane Grahowski, was able to help us arrange probably about 2009 so that any page in the journal could be reproduced in color, in full color, at no charge to authors, so that we didn't have color plates hidden somewhere, and that wherever a picture deserved to go in the journal, if it existed in our world in the Echo Lab in color, that's the way you'd see it. And I think that's been a nice advantage, and it's allowed us to encourage authors to use colors in their illustrations for more effectiveness. Probably fair to ask ourselves, how have we done? And that depends, of course, on what you measure and how you measure it. Submissions is one way to look at success, and our submissions have gone up over time, although they've stabilized in the past several years. They've stabilized in an environment where the number of journals is almost twice than when I took over, and there have been some big players in cardiovascular imaging, and that hasn't really hurt our submissions. We still manage to get enough submissions so that our acceptance rate is somewhere in the 20 to 25% range, which I think is selective enough but not overly exclusive. We had submissions last year from 38 different countries, alphabetically ranging from Argentina to the USA. I'm looking for that paper from Zambia if somebody can help me out. About a third of the papers come from the United States, about just under 30% from 17 different countries in Europe, some smaller ones, and about 30% from Australia, New Zealand, and 12 countries in Asia, again some very large ones and some smaller ones. So it says American on the cover, but it's really an international journal, and I think appropriately so. Another marker of success might be the essential journal study that the New England Journal published in 2011. They do these periodically. I don't know when the next one may be occurring, but it's an interesting study because it involved a survey of physicians. They did this for multiple different specialties. For cardiovascular, they surveyed 1,000 physicians done independently, not by New England Journal, and they asked the survey responders to tell them their 10 top essential journals. Essential defined as one that reports medical breakthroughs, has practice-changing impact, and is essential to read. Importantly, the people who responded were requested to come up with the names of the journals they thought it critical to read, not based on a list of journals or a bunch of pictures, but by their actual recollection of what they thought they needed to go to look at. And here were the results. Of course, Jack and Cirque and the New England Journal were very highly rated, as they should have been. But JASE was one of the journals listed here, and there are some fairly prominent ones that weren't. And I thought that meant a lot to me, that practitioners thought it important to read the journal. And then finally, the journal impact factor, which is one of these quality markers, like most quality markers, that are easy to measure and may or may not have much to do with quality. The journal impact factor is, in simple terms, the average number of citations for each paper published in the journal. And for 2017, for example, the impact factor will be determined by the number of citations in 2017 of articles published in JASE but cited wherever in any other English language journal or in JASE in the 2 preceding years, 2015 and 2016, divided by the number of citable articles published in the journal in those same 2 years. So you may be wondering, what's the 2017 impact factor? Well, it isn't the end of 2017 yet. We couldn't possibly count that. We have to wait until 2018 to have those numbers. And in fact, the 2016 impact factor, which will be based on 2014 and 2015 data, will be released probably in about 2 weeks. It usually comes out somewhere in the middle or latter part of June. So I'm either surprised by it as I'm coming to the podium, or it comes out the next day. I don't know what it's going to be, but we're told that we're likely going to be happy with it. I'll show you, and it's Clarivate Analytics is who's in charge of this if you're interested in looking it up. But here, what we did between 2007 and present, as Jonathan said, we started just a little above 2. We've gone up steadily. We're about a little more than twice. And more importantly, I think the rank of cardiovascular systems journals, there were 74 in 2007. We were about middle of the pack. And in the past years, we've been in the top 25%. And I would not be surprised if the rank improves even further in 2016. So I would say that the journal is currently in good health. We have enough submissions to pick out appropriate papers to publish with an acceptance rate, again, that I think is reasonable but not so exclusive that it's hard to justify. We have worldwide appeal. I think the scientific quality has improved and that it's recognized, and the quality indicators I've shared with you have been positive. And I'm going to wrap up with a couple of quick slides, and we're still a little bit ahead of time. So I'm certainly quite clear that editing's a team sport, and I owe a great deal to Victor and Jonathan, and also to Jules Garden, Brian Hoyt, Wyman Lai, Sharif Naga, Philippe Pibarot, and Jeff Stevenson, who have been enormously bright and insightful and supportive and wonderful to work with. The journal is good because we've had good people. Debbie Meyer also deserves a great deal of credit. She's going to hang out in the background and hope not to be noticed, but we couldn't do what we did without her. And Jane Grahowski, our publisher, has been a source of wisdom and support for a long time. And so I'm going to wrap up by saying I've learned that an editor doesn't just decide whether a paper is or isn't good enough to publish. That's kind of the easy part. But from my perspective, and as you've heard discussed this morning, I think the editor's job is to consider how a paper might be improved in terms of scientific methodology and presentation, enhancing the likelihood of publication, and to be able to articulate that to authors in a way that they understand that we're on their side, that at the end of the day, this is all about a better quality paper that's more useful to readers, to the authors themselves, and to our patients. As you know, Mike is going to be taking over the reins of the journal in 2018, and I know he is well positioned to do a great job. And so I'm going to end by saying it's been a great honor and a greater privilege to be the editor-in-chief for the past 10 years or so. And I thank you all for your attention and your support over time.
Let's give him a standing ovation.